Hi, this is Dr. Adrian Lopresti. Join us on FX Medicine next week, where we'll be talking to Professor Peter Drummond about the psychology of pain. Subscribe to us on your favourite podcast app and follow us on social media to make sure you never miss an episode.
Hi, and welcome to FX Medicine, where we bring you the latest in evidence-based, integrative, functional, and complementary medicine. FX Medicine acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia where we live and work, and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. With us today is Christine Pope, who is an experienced naturopath and nutritionist. Christine is also an experienced trainer and presenter and was head of nutritional medicine and homeopathy at Nature Care College at St Leonard's. Christine is a director and treasurer of the Australian Traditional Medicine Society and the Council of Small Business Organisations of Australia. In 2016, Christine undertook training with Dr. Dale Bredesen in his protocol for reversing Alzheimer's. Subsequently, her focus in clinic has been working on healthy ageing and reducing the impact of chronic disease. Welcome to FX Medicine, Christine. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're more than welcome, Emma. I'm looking forward to this podcast.
Me too. Now, let me set the scene. With 1 in 6 Australians, or 4.2 million Aussies aged 65 and older, this topic is more relevant than ever. Australia's population is ageing due to increasing life expectancy and declining fertility rates. Both the number of people at older ages is growing, and older people are representing an increasing share of the total population. By 2066, it's predicted that people over 65 will make up a third of the total population, which is a lot higher than the 16% rate today. And the number of Australians aged 85 years and over is projected to double by 2042, increasing to over 1 million people. Now, Christine, let's start with the baseline. What role can complementary and functional medicine practitioners play in patients aging well?
I think this is an area where there is a huge amount that we can do. And the primary focus, I think, is on getting people on a really supportive diet. Doesn't need to be complicated or, in terms of what they're eating, but just getting them across a few fundamentals in terms of, eating enough protein and having enough vegetables, those two things alone. If you can get people doing those, it's amazing how often they start to feel better. The other part of it, I think, is a lot of the lifestyle changes that people need to make. And again, people often, they're retiring increasingly at older ages as well.
True.
And, they may not, they say in retirement you need 5 hobbies. And I don't want one of those hobbies to be going to see your medical specialist.
Good point.
I actually want them to have hobbies that are getting them out there and active, but also socially connected. So I think if I was going to say what are the 3 areas where we can play a huge difference: diet, the lifestyle changes, and making sure they're doing the right sort of exercise for their age and stage and it's appropriate for them.
Yeah, perfectly. And I would have to agree with you. We are perfectly placed. I mean, naturopathic medicine, it's all diet and lifestyle. We have an innate ability to be able to work in this space.
Exactly. We've got a great toolkit. And I think, we're also, as naturopaths, we're all usually really focused on, what it is that we can offer the client, but also where else should they be going? What are the other things they should be doing that are really going to support them? I mean, with exercise in particular, I think everyone, who's hitting that over 60 age group has had a bad experience with exercise. Yeah. Whether it was the 80s aerobics boom where you came out of the class and you could barely walk because, the 20-year-old teacher thought that everyone should be able to do what she could do. There are people who have tried, running and done their knees or, that as you get older, there's a few aches and pains associated with, the more sport you played, probably the more aches and pains you've got. So I think it's really important that when we encourage people to get back to exercise, we do it in a way that's tailored for where they're at. And, I usually prefer wherever possible that they're working with someone in either a small group or one-on-one.
Yeah.
So an exercise physiologist, or perhaps, I'm a big fan of have the assessment at, say, Pilates, and then do a small class so that you've got someone there making sure you're doing things properly, you're doing things at the right level, and you're building up gradually.
Yeah.
Rather than this just, no pain, no gain, which is probably the worst thing that anyone could suggest for someone who's over 60.
That's true. The risk of injury is going to be a lot higher.
Well, and it's also pain's a really valuable mechanism for telling us something's wrong. We need to be at this stage, we need to stretch but not strain ourselves.
Now, can you tell us the difference between the words lifespan and health span? Because this really fascinates me.
Look, I think it's a lovely description, health span, but lifespan is basically the biological age. You're going to live to you probably, if you're a woman, maybe 86, 87. If you're a man, maybe 82.
Okay.
Health span is the period of that where you're actually functioning really well.
Okay, yeah.
And I always remember seeing one of the suppliers who did this graph where it was like there was kind of this straight line going down from, early years to later years. And then they had, I'm trying to think, like a curve. And you could always move across to be higher on the curve if you changed your diet, or if you improved your diet, started exercising, and made a few other changes. So, it's really moving from that lifespan focus to a health span focus. And someone else said to me, you just want to be able to get off the toilet by yourself when you're 80.
Yes, and that sit to stand is critical.
But you can't do that if you're not exercising and using your, the leg and hip muscles on a regular basis.
And I think having that focus of health span is such a positive way of looking at aging. I really love how positive that is.
Yeah, well, I like it much better than anti-aging, which implies in some way aging's bad. It's like, actually, we're privileged to be able to age. And, to be in a country where we have a healthcare system which does support aging population, we're not being put out on the ice at 60 when our teeth aren't good anymore.
Yep. Anti-aging, it is a good reframe on that word. But let's talk a bit deeper about aging. What actually happens during the process of aging?
I just think of more of as a slowing down of function.
Okay.
And, when I was looking at the work on Alzheimer's and dementia, which we're going to come to later, one of the things is, you think about that as you get older, that process of expressing a thought and verbalising it becomes slower. So I think the thing is the repair becomes slower, everything else becomes slower, and then if you're suffering deficiencies as well, things aren't going to work as well. You're going to start to have problems with various organs and either need more support or things are going to start breaking down. So
that wear and tear on the body.
I prefer to think of it as, more of a slowing down of the repair and maintenance.
Okay, much nicer reframe. Now, you're in clinical practice quite a lot. I'd love to know what biomarkers do you assess in the ageing demographic? What do you keep your eyes on?
Well, look, I'm really lucky in my area because most of the time my clients come in with 8 pages of blood tests.
Yeah.
And what I'm really interested in is anything to do with basically insulin, inflammation and hormones. So I'm looking at, if they've got fasting blood sugars or glucose tolerance test, or even better, an HbA1c to see how it's been over the previous 3 months and not just affected by having a bingy weekend the day before you did the testing.
Yeah.
Inflammatory markers like ESR or CRP, which are good at telling you about that there is a high level of inflammation there. They're not necessarily so useful at pointing you in the direction of where the inflammation is, but you can get that information from a good case taking. And then also your hormonal indicators. Things like, checking on thyroid I think is really important. 1 in 8 people as they age start to have problems with their thyroid.
Oh, that's a lot.
Which is often sometimes driven by medications.
Okay.
So there are a couple of medications that really do not support your thyroid particularly well, the arrhythmia medications, for example.
Okay.
And then I also think of the thyroid as being a bit of a general marker for decline, because often it doesn't tend to struggle until everything else is having problems. So because your blood sugar's been out of whack for years, because you're exhausted and fatigued or under a huge amount of stress, you then start having challenges with your thyroid.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's just as simple as the common nutrient deficiencies like zinc and iron and selenium. You don't have the nutrients there to support your thyroid. And since thyroid's all about growth and repair and energy, it's really important that level be optimized.
Yeah, I love that. And if I think about it, most general blood tests that people would get done would most likely have an HbA1c on there. It would have, ESR or CRP and TSH. So a lot of the time our patients will come in with some great information already. We just have to know what to look for.
And that's it. And the other thing I look for, and even if they've got like a full blood count, it's looking and seeing, where's their hemoglobin at? Is it declining over time? Is there signs in their white blood cells that there's, that their immune system may be struggling? And then, after you've looked at that and based on the case, you can then go and see what other blood tests you need or whether you need some other functional testing.
Yeah, I really love that because it just gives us the basics. We don't need to get fancy straight away. We can get some really good information from a general set of bloods.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, look, there is so much useful information in a general set of bloods, but it's also the fact that a lot of doctors aren't really happy to do, a page full of testing as an initial screen. They actually want it, they need to be able to justify why they're doing the test and actually understand what the test is. So if I'm asking someone to go back to their GP and get more testing, I always want to make sure that the GP understands why and can therefore justify it from a testing perspective.
Yeah, super important that we're working collaboratively in that way.
Oh, absolutely. And, if you do work collaboratively and respectfully in that way, I think it then pays off down the track and people, most doctors can't actually refer to a naturopath per se, but, they can suggest that people may find this useful.
Exactly. That's right. Now let's, I'd love to talk through the stages so that we can start breaking this down to clinically relevant information. So could you perhaps give us an overview of the age-related trends most often seen in each decade from the age of 50? Could we chunk it in this way?
Look, I suppose the thing is, what I find is that I guess it's more of a systems challenge.
Okay.
So in your 50s, if people have had less than optimal diet for, say, a couple of decades, this is when they normally start to see metabolic challenges.
Okay.
And whether that's they're pre-diabetic or, in fact, they're actually starting to show signs of type 2 diabetes, that's probably more likely to emerge in that decade.
Okay.
And from there, then you've got other, health challenges emerging, which if you've got metabolic challenges, then you're more likely to be starting to suffering from cognitive and cardiovascular challenges in your 60s and 70s.
Okay.
And depending on how well you manage it in your 50s, those things can start to emerge and become more problematic. And, the thing is, I always liked, I'm not sure if it was Bredesen or someone else, Dale Bredesen, who used the term, but talked about cognitive decline or Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes.
Okay.
So you can see how important it is in making sure that, and, those sort of things tend to emerge more in your 60s.
Okay. It's really interesting.
70s and 80s, you're really looking more at just general slowdown and whether there's something that needs more support from an organ function perspective, whether it's digestive. A lot of the time I find a lot of people start to see a lot more digestive problems. And one of the really small things that I think is so critical is getting stomach acid right.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, huge.
Because, you see this declining picture of, the hemoglobin's coming down, you get an iron panel done, and you're looking, the iron's really declining. What's going on here? Generally, it's because that first obstacle is having enough stomach acid to break down the food into smaller molecules so it can be absorbed. And their stomach acid is declining. And you just support gentle improvement in stomach acid, and you usually see digestion improving and overall health improving.
I love that. Such a beautiful naturopathic way of treating. I really was interested in, from the 50s, you sort of start seeing this pattern of metabolic issues, the beginning of insulin resistance. So I feel as practitioners, if we know this, we can really keep our eyes on our patients in this demographic, knowing how important the metabolic function is for their next couple of decades of health span.
Yeah, and I'd probably say metabolic and digestive function, because I don't know about you, but I have observed in clinic that through when women hit perimenopause and menopause, often that's the time when their digestion and intolerances seem to build up.
Yeah.
Or are re-expressed even, and I did read one interesting article that was saying it has to do with the fact that when you're having fewer ovulatory periods, you're producing less progesterone naturally. So the progesterone that's released from the rupture of the corpus luteum, you're having a non-ovulatory cycle, you're not having that. So progesterone is often used for other pathways like corticosteroids, suppressing inflammation. So that's why you get more aches and pains, and also you start to suffer more from intolerances.
Super interesting, right?
It's amazing. And it's amazing how the body can compensate and other things. It may settle down, but I do find with a lot of people, this is the period of their time their lives when they go, I really can't tolerate dairy. Like I always thought it was a bit of a problem, but now I'm absolutely convinced it's a problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I spoke to my dad last week and he said almost those exact words. So, yeah, you really see it play out. Now, when you're looking at nutrient depletions in this demographic, what are the key drivers for nutrient depletions?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, one of the key drivers is people who've been on Nexium or something similar for a long period of time. It's dietary, poor dietary patterns. So, for example, people who have had minimal protein in their diet, it's going to tend to be iron and zinc.
Okay.
Because, they're the most effective sources of it from a nutritional perspective. And a lot of women, when they get stressed, I think, tend to reach more for carbs than they do for protein.
Definitely.
Yeah. So the other one that's coming up a lot is vitamin D, but I also look at the B vitamins as well, because this is an area where it's got a really broad reach. And I know I saw a meme online that said, learn Krebs cycle, forget Krebs cycle. And this was this is exactly what I remember doing when I was at college constantly. But whenever you look at how do you get energy from food, it's multiple of those B vitamins that you need. And it's always one, because I always use a multivitamin. I know some practitioners who are like, oh, you're B3 and you're B6 and you're this, and give 3 different supplements. But I've always found that supporting them with one pill, I might actually have a chance in hell that they take it. And 2, it supports that whole process of generating energy from your food.
Yeah, I like that.
And then, maybe moving from, getting, the worst case is you're only getting 2 units of ATP to 38 units of ATP. So even if you can push them further through that process, they're going to be getting more energy out of their food and it's going to be easier for them to function well.
Yeah, absolutely. And other causes or drivers for nutrient depletions, I see a lot of constipation in older people. So does that tie into the nutrient depletions? It's a bit of a chicken and the egg, really.
Well, I think the thing is, if it's sitting there for a long period of time, chances are they're not absorbing particularly well. So even if the diet's okay and it's going in, and I'd suggest if they're having long-term constipation, it's probably not the right diet for them. So the first thing you're going to do is actually address the fibre, fluid fundamentals.
Yeah.
But also looking at whether what they're eating actually agrees with them. So, I've used a range of different intolerance testing over time, but it's amazing how many times just getting people into eating the right food for them will actually make a big difference. And, sometimes it's dairy, sometimes it's wheat, sometimes it's weird things. Like I had one lady where it was avocado and chicken, not 2 foods you think of as being particularly unhealthy.
No, that poor lady.
Well, the thing was, it was really interesting because it's just like it's also, she also came up with she'd been intolerant to eggs as a child. So, there was that sort of thing there. But I also think it came up through perimenopause. So I'm wondering whether a lot of chicken in Australia is very young and it's very hormone heavy because it's been, it's about 50 days old when it's slaughtered. So possibly she could deal with her own hormones, but maybe not someone else's as well.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So when we're talking about nutrient deficiencies, which ones do you think are the most prevalent, and what are some clinical signs that we could be looking out for, keeping on our radar?
So one of the ones that I think is most prevalent, because we've all been trained to be paranoid about sunshine, is vitamin D. And I often find this connected with magnesium. So, you need enough magnesium to take up vitamin D. You need enough D to take up magnesium. So I found if I supplement them together, I get much better results. And typically with that deficiency, it's more. So common thing would be I'm getting every bug that's going around. So this age group, I'm looking after the grandkids and they're bringing stuff home from childcare.
Yes.
But I'm getting every bug that's going around. I've got cramps. I have trouble getting to sleep or staying asleep.
Okay.
These are the sort of things I see with vitamin D and magnesium. But really, the leading indicator for vitamin D is usually immune system.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And then, I guess in terms of probably the other biggest one is zinc.
Okay.
And again, it comes back to when you look at food sources, often they're being told not to eat the food sources that are really good for zinc. Whether it's fear of cholesterol because of oysters or fear of dietary fats in red meat, that tends to be an area. And I mean, zinc is so important for, it's important for 300 enzymes to function in the body. But also from a digestive perspective, you need it to trigger the production of enzymes. You need it to protect the gut lining. So if all those things aren't happening, if you're not producing good level of enzymes, then you're probably having trouble breaking down your food.
Exactly. All right, so vitamin D and magnesium, I love that little insight there. The frequent infections, the cramps, maybe some sleep issues, and I'm smiling because it is exactly what patients will say in this age group is they were looking after the grandkids and they're picking up everything that their grandkids have. And it's like, well, should it be that you're picking up everything? Probably not. So I love that little insight on vitamin D and magnesium. And zinc, I do think a lot of people will not be eating enough, say, red meat because of those fears around cholesterol and fat, not getting the amount of zinc in that they need to produce their enzymes, protect their gut lining and optimize their digestion.
Exactly.
Any other nutrients that you see quite often a bit low? Okay,
this is because of other testing I'm doing. Iodine. Iodine is, I know. It's one of those ones that comes up, and if it's iodine and chromium, it's a complete metabolism nightmare.
Okay, so, tell me more.
You've already, because I'm already going down that rabbit hole of metabolism and insulin resistance, so you've got low chromium and low iodine. Your thyroid's low. You can't, because chromium's a key component of glucose tolerance factor.
Okay.
So you're not managing your blood sugars particularly well. But I was going to say the iodine is really subtle. Like it doesn't have nice, clear symptoms. Do you know what I mean? It's like the only thing is it is connected with fibrocystic breasts, but you don't always ask women about that. So it's not so common. But I remember seeing something about iodine is a tonic for the glands.
Okay.
So whenever you've got glands that aren't performing well, thyroid, obviously you think about iodine.
Yeah.
But other glands as well, people don't necessarily think about the role of iodine. So, that one comes up occasionally. And I remember because the testing I use is a little bit different, I will send them to get a urinary iodine done. And I remember one of my clients saying her doctor thought it was ridiculous, but he agreed to do it anyway. And then he came back, because his view was no one was low in iodine. But when the results came back, he said, except for you, you've got the lowest iodine I've ever seen.
Yeah, it is quite a common one. Why do you think it's commonly low, though, to start with?
Well, we used to apparently use an iodizing solution to wash the milk containers. So even as kids, because remember we all got the school milk and stuff, we're all getting traces with any of the dairy that we had, as well as fish and seafood. So, you know, the old Mediterranean diet about having seafood on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Because the things with iodine in it, there's not a lot of options. I think nutritionally there's organic eggs, but not factory eggs.
Right, yeah.
Which makes sense because they're not getting a range of nutrients. They're just being fed, pellets.
Yeah.
You've got your fish. Basically anything comes out of the ocean has iodine in it, but a lot of people have got into like Himalayan rock salt, which is great for other nutrients but doesn't have iodine in it because it doesn't come from the ocean. So I get people to have Celtic sea salt, which is great and looks a bit minky but tastes amazing and adds such flavour. And has the iodine as well in a really nice form.
Yeah.
Or, depending on how low their levels are, I might be looking at kelp or even if people don't like eating seaweed, what I get them to do is when they're cooking is put it in the stock or water.
Okay.
And then take it out and don't eat it.
That's an easy way for it to infuse into their food. Yeah. So when it comes to supplements, I know you're not a prolific supplement person, which means you're very judicious with the use of them. Are there any supplements that you find particularly useful in the aging demographic and why?
I'm a big fan of a multi-mineral.
Yeah. Okay.
I find it's alkalizing, but, let's face it, who doesn't do well with a lovely magnesium powder?
Yeah.
I always remember that from my early days studying with Kira Sutherland. But, I like it with combination of potassium, a little bit of sodium in it, because if people are cooking from scratch, they really don't need to worry about their sodium. In fact, more often they can be deficient in sodium.
Okay.
And, ideally a bit of chromium. I think the other things I use a lot of, I've moved a lot more to SPMs, which I find really useful for brain fog and aches and pains.
Okay, great.
I've been having some nice responses with a magnesium with P, which is on both sleep and pain. And I think the other one that I'm really, really liking at the moment is berberine. So I found that a lot of the because I tend to use tablets rather than liquids. I seem to attract people who don't really like taking. Don't know why, but they seem to reject my lovely liquid herb mixes.
Yeah, okay.
It's probably because I originally trained as a homeopath, so I've trained my clients that they can all have the minimum dose. And then, when I try to give them liquid herbs, they just look at me like I'm trying to poison them. But I have found berberine to have some really useful effects in terms of blood sugar metabolism. And I'm not sure if part of it isn't because of its effect on the microbiome as much as anything else.
Okay, so there's some really good, insightful options there. SPMs, a good magnesium powder, multi-mineral, berberine. I wanted to move to, we've alluded to it a couple of times, but let's go there, to insulin resistance, both in the muscles and the brain. I read one paper that highlighted the negative impact of insulin resistance, particularly on memory function. And researchers found a clear link between increased insulin resistance, cognitive decline and aging, as you said previously. I would love to know more about this insulin resistance, and I'd love some strategies for addressing this.
So I think the first thing is, if we go to why is the brain so much more affected than anywhere else, it's basically the brain uses 30% of the glucose in the body. Now, you consider the brain weighs 2.5 kilos compared to the rest of the body.
Yeah.
That's a huge load that it's taking on, or that, it's a huge amount of it that it's actually consuming relative to the rest of the body. So, on that level, a lot of my clients look at me and go, so I should be eating more carbs. I'm like, no, it's not that simple. What's really important for this is making sure your blood sugar is balanced and coming back to that fundamental of, getting protein with every meal to actually make sure that you're not having spikes and troughs in your blood sugars and then impacting on your insulin resistance and making it worse.
Okay.
It is like I know with a number of older people I've seen recently, and I'm talking, 70s and 80s,
Okay.
just getting them eating enough protein has been a complete game changer. And I'm not talking a huge amount. I'm talking a gram per kilo.
Okay.
So, but all of a sudden they seem to have more energy and they weren't reaching for the sweet foods. And it really does make a huge difference to brain function. So therefore, you can actually have more effective memory.
Yeah. And that's relatively simple from a dietary intervention perspective, which we can all be employing that 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight as a rule. Easy but effective.
And it's not a huge amount of protein. That's the other thing. I said to someone, it's like the equivalent of 2 eggs at breakfast, a small tin of tuna at lunch and maybe a chicken breast fillet at dinner. We're not talking, because, if you go overboard on protein, there are other issues. And, as you get older, your kidneys will probably have trouble breaking it down and handling as much of it as, where you're eating it to excess. But I think there's a real benefit. And look, the other thing I always say is, in terms of you're eating vegetarian proteins, I think the analogy was 1 palm size, palm thickness, and with a plant protein, it's 2.
Okay.
So you do need to be eating more when you're eating a plant protein, but it's a perfectly viable option.
Okay, that's great. That's great. I love that parameter, 1 gram per kilo of body weight. Let's move to toxicity. So how does toxicity impact aging, and what drives this burden of toxicity in older adults, and what can we do about it?
Well, if you look at how does it impact aging in terms of cellular damage, I mean, your body is actually, when you were younger, it's really good at protecting us.
Yeah.
And, filtering out harmful substances and excreting them through the skin or the liver or the kidneys, it processes them through the liver. There's 6 processes it can go through. But usually what it's doing is making it water soluble so it can be removed through the feces. Now, as those pathways, I guess, become overwhelmed, or we don't have the ability to support them from a nutrient perspective, then to a certain extent it's a bit like a factory. You start moving through other lines, but at a point it becomes overburdened, and then the body has to just pack those toxins somewhere. Now, one of the things about heavy metal toxicity is if you've got a lot of heavy metals in your body, what your body does to protect you is it puts more fat around that. So if you're having trouble losing weight, just tell everyone it's your body protecting you against heavy metal toxicity.
And what else is adding to that toxicity in older adults?
Look, I think it's a really involved picture, but I mean, from a perspective of, when you're going through perimenopause, menopause, you've got all the hormonal breakdown that you need to be dealing with. So you've got a higher burden of hormones that you're coping with. You've got common things like alcohol and smoking, etc., which for a lot of us, I don't think a lot of people smoke anymore, but a lot of us dealt with the burden of secondhand smoke as we were growing up.
Definitely, yeah.
So, there is that to deal with. It's also the number of chemicals we're exposed to. I think there was one study done that said the average woman is exposed to 168 chemicals in her personal care products.
Yeah.
168.
That's shocking.
And then God forbid you start cleaning the house. But I use things like the Enyo and Norwex products and, try and reduce the chemical burden as much as possible. But we've come up with a lot of great chemicals for various functions, but we haven't really thought through whether they should all be used in combination. And I do think that is a hidden burden of toxicity as we get older.
And I find a lot of that is hard to measure.
It's really hard to measure.
It's quite ubiquitous, really. What can we do about it, though?
Look, I think in terms of one of the things I always do is when I'm doing testing is if they do come up with a level of heavy metals is looking at the sources. Is there any way you can remove this from the body?
Yeah.
Remove the exposure, because we can do a lot of work on, supporting detox processes, et cetera, but it's a lot of herbs, it's a lot of treatment, and really it's much simpler to get them to get a good water filter.
Yeah,
Reduce the burden coming in. If they've got old fillings, fillings were designed to last for 20 years. You'd be amazed how many people still have them in their mouths 40 and 50 years later. and they're not stable at that point. So if they're not stable, there can be mercury leaking into the system, which is incredibly dangerous. And everyone worries about deep ocean fish.
Yeah.
But seriously, 3 fillings is going to give you 5 times the exposure.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people forget that they've got fillings. I know that's been my experience in clinical practice. They've completely forgotten that they're there. So they do need to address those. Are there particular herbs or nutrients that you do use in situations like this?
Look, it's all the lovely liver herbs in terms of supporting detox pathways. But, usually I like something with milk thistle, something to support the gallbladder detoxification. And I'm also quite a fan of using some of the clinoptophyllite binders as well, because I've found that they're actually quite helpful at going through the system. I do also use some homeopathic chelation, but that's probably a little more specific. And what I find is it very gently mobilises things out. It doesn't necessarily get you a big shift quickly, but it just seems to support that pathway to remove it.
Gentle is good in cases like this, I think.
Yeah, you don't want to dump a bunch of toxins into someone's system.
No.
That is not a good outcome. And look, I'm very cautious with detoxification. In terms of when I'm using products, I will tend to do, I'll start with the liver and I might use half the recommended dose, and then I move through to the kidneys as well, after having got them on a really good diet for, say, 6 to 8 weeks to start with.
Great.
So detoxification is something I do towards the end, not at the start.
Yes, that's a really nice way of doing it.
Well, and I've also found that when people had nagging symptoms, lingering symptoms, a good detox just kind of eases all that out.
Perfect. Now, I would love to shift across to exercise and get your thoughts in this space. A literature review I read looked at the effect of physical activity on life expectancy, and the relative risk of death is approximately 20 to 35% lower in physically active and fit people compared to inactive and unfit people, which equates to approximately 3.5 to 4 years higher life expectancy for physically active people, which I think is absolutely astounding. What do you think is driving those incredible outcomes?
Well, I think first up, it's move it or lose it. So it's also about being able to, fundamentally do all those things that mean you can stay at home and look after yourself.
Yeah.
And, if you look at the average lifespan in nursing homes, I think it's about 9 months. So, yes, as an example of what happens when you're physically inactive and how it affects you. But I also think it's a function of actually exercise is really great at helping you balance blood sugar. So you're going to reduce any of those metabolic risk factors as well, which all that, as we talked about, the metabolic factors increase your risk of cardio risk factors and cognitive decline. So those sort of things, being physically active, and, it can be simple things like having a walk for 20 minutes after dinner can help reduce the blood sugar spike.
Yeah, and it's something that's so simple and easy to do.
Exactly. And so much more fun than washing the dishes and cleaning the kitchen afterwards.
Absolutely. Now, moving to one of my favourite topics, food as medicine. Now, you did mention protein before, but I wanted to dive into sarcopenia. From the age of 50, muscle mass decreases 1 to 2% annually and muscle strength by up to 3%. Now, in men, that process is more progressive. It's slower, while in women, there's an abrupt decrease in muscle coinciding with menopause. But sarcopenia affects 30% of people between the ages of 60 and 80, and I was shocked it was that many. But what dietary advice do you specifically give older patients to prevent sarcopenia?
Well, as you mentioned, the protein is key, but it's also about doing some form of weight-bearing exercise, even if it's really simple, like get a pair of half-kilo weights and have them on your desk and do reps of, bicep curls 6 times a day.
Yeah.
Because I think the thing is, it's losing that muscle strength that affects everything else. And I mean, at the end of the day, the heart is a muscle too.
Yeah, true.
So, and with sarcopenia, you can also have fat through the muscle, which means the muscle's becoming less effective.
Right.
it's when I was using the quad scan and you're looking at muscle mass and you can see people with a high fat content, they'll always bring up a warning, which is about the fact that they have this level of fat through the muscle. So I think sarcopenia, is a significant risk factor for aging, because what it's doing, as you lose muscle mass, you lose ability to stabilise and, prevent falls.
Of course, yeah, the risk of fractures is going to increase, right?
Yeah, and one of the things I saw with when I was looking at the different types of exercise, it's really important to have a balance of cardio, strength work, and also stress management activities.
Okay.
And each of them had a different benefit for the brain. And now you're going to ask me what they were, and I can't remember which one went with which. But it was really important to be doing strength work so that you had good stability.
Right.
Because I think it's also that spiral of, because you're feeling unsafe, you are less likely to exercise, which then means more sarcopenia and more other problems.
Yeah, absolutely. It will start spiraling. You can see that propensity there. Now, I was reading a 2021 research paper comparing the modified Paleolithic diet and low saturated fat diet in relapsing MS. Can you talk us through that? Because I feel there's some clinical pearls we can perhaps extrapolate from this research paper.
So this was the comparison of the Walls versus the Swank diet. So the Swank diet was an Australian doctor, and it's a low saturated fat diet. It's been used for a very long time, and it's been helpful for people with relapsing multiple sclerosis.
Okay.
Whereas, by contrast, the Walls protocol is a modified paleo diet, very high level of fruit and vegetables.
Right.
And she's also a big fan of organ meat. But what was really interesting in those two diets, and it's not a big study, but it's very hard to do studies where you're changing people's diet for 12, 24 weeks.
Oh, hugely difficult.
Actually, yeah, I know. Was after 12 weeks, there was improvement in quality of life in both groups.
Okay.
So both the Swank's diet and the Walls diet, both of them had a good level of vegetables in there as well. And I suspicion part of the improvement is from the fact that a lot of the people in the US who are doing this probably weren't eating great diets to start with.
Okay.
Interestingly, Walls' diet had better P scores, so lower P scores, showing more statistical significance. And there was more improvement at the 24-week mark, whereas Swank's seemed to sort of stabilise at about the 12-week mark.
Okay.
The other thing that was interesting was with the Walls protocol, there was improvement in the mini mental state assessment as well. So this study was done, I think 72 people finished the study. So it was actually quite a good sized study when you're looking at that sort of detailed protocol. And they were also getting support on other levels as well. But I thought if I was looking at those two, I'd be going, look, it looks like the modified paleo is actually going to provide you with ongoing improvements with MS, whereas Swank's probably going to keep you where you are, maybe see a bit of an improvement.
Okay. And with that modified Paleolithic diet, what exactly were they eating? Like, what were they avoiding? Or, what are the things that we can take from a clinical tips aspect from that modified Paleolithic diet?
I think it was the modified paleo had up to 6 cups of vegetables a day.
Wow, great. Okay.
Well, sorry, fruit and vegetables, but I think they're a bit more restrictive in terms of the paleo nature of it.
Okay.
A decent amount of protein, but not excessive. Whereas the Swank diet also had a similar level of, didn't have that same level of vegetable matter. And I think there you were getting really intense nutrition from food.
Okay.
If you're eating that quantity.
Yeah. If you ask the average person how many cups of vegetables a day they'd be eating, it's rare that someone would actually say 6. So I think if we can have that one key takeaway that we need to be aiming for 6 cups of vegetables a day, I think that in itself is going to make a great difference.
It is. I did have one elderly lady who had chronic constipation. Saw her again. I'd seen her a few times, and then she came and tapped me on the shoulder after yoga class one day and said, "Oh, dear, look, that first bit of information you gave me made such a difference." And it was basically, so I went back to my notes because, 18 months later, I'm not going to remember. And it was 3 cups of vegetables a day.
Oh,
So, 30 years of constipation because she wasn't eating enough vegetables.
incredible.
Yeah, exactly. So, it does make a big difference. But I imagine with kind of flooding the body with nutrition, and I think that's the other part of it that would make a real difference.
Yeah, all the phytochemicals in those vegetables would just be lighting up their system.
Exactly.
Now, I looked at another fascinating prospective study, and this came from the UK Biobank epidemiological data on over 110,000 people. It looked at the impact of a Mediterranean lifestyle on health outcomes. And what's super fascinating about this study is it's the first one looking at Mediterranean lifestyle, not just Mediterranean diet, but in a non-Mediterranean population. And this included looking at whether the participants not only ate a Mediterranean diet, but also their social habits, their rest, their conviviality and exercise. And it showed that people who lived a lifestyle more aligned with the Mediterranean lifestyle had up to a 29% reduction in all-cause mortality and up to 28% lower risk of cancer mortality. But interestingly, the strongest correlation for these high benefits came from those who scored highly in the social habits, rest, conviviality, and exercise. And after reading this, it got me thinking that health span is so much more than just what people consume and their movement. And I wanted you to touch on this space of, where connection or where this conviviality part of health span.
Well, you go back to that earlier comment about you need 5 hobbies in retirement. It's all about social connection, isn't it? Ultimately, most hobbies are not done alone, whether it's, playing bowls or golf or something like that, whether it's some form of craft or volunteer work or something where you're actually getting out and meeting with people. I mean, given what we went through in the last few years with COVID, it's not surprising that actual social connectivity is so important to people's lifespans.
Yeah.
Because it really is, ultimately we're not just here to eat. We're very social beings and we need that connection with people on a regular basis. And also, the other thing is it's getting out, getting moving.
Yeah, yes.
Which more the exercise component. But it's really interesting. I've got family in the UK and my grandmother passed at 101.
Wow.
And she never had a car. She used to walk down to the village shops every day with a little trolley and buy her food and bring it back and cook it.
Yeah.
Which when you go to it is actually very Mediterranean. It's because when you're in Greece or Italy, everything's up a hill, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you're maintaining your muscle mass. You're actually down talking to people every day. You're cooking from fresh. All those things make a difference to the quality of the food you're eating, but also the quality of your social connections. And interestingly, the family members who smoked all probably died in their early 70s.
Okay.
And my grandparents who didn't smoke, I think my grandpa at 95 was still going to the local pub and they'd pour him his pint of Guinness and it would sit on the bar and get nice and warm for him.
Yeah.
Every day.
Wow. You sure have those longevity genes, don't you?
Yeah, well, they're on one side of the family, not off the other, unfortunately. But I think what I took out of that was they never had a car. They kept moving. I remember my grandfather in his mid-80s taking us for a walk around a local park, which is, big gardens called Daisy Nook. And he nearly killed us. And we were, I mean, we had just got off a plane after 24 hours of travel, but it still seemed that he was much more active into older age than most people.
Yeah, so keeping up that activity is so critical and having it part of that incidental way of life seems to be a key there.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, where you're doing it without even thinking about it.
Now,
so every Monday morning when I go up to my local coffee bar, I'm doing that, activity.
Exactly, that's right, using your feet as transport.
Yes, exactly.
I've got one last question for you, Christine.
Sure.
I know that you have done training in the Bredesen Protocol. Can you maybe give us 2 clinical tips that we can take from that body of work? I mean, it's a huge body of work, but I would just like you to distill a couple of clinically relevant tips for us.
Look, I think for me, one of the things was optimising hormones. And in terms of clinical tips, they were actually using bioidentical hormone replacement, which is very challenging for me because, you know, I'd come out of that generation that had been trained post that big study.
Yeah.
So, but it was really interesting to see the benefit in terms of, you know, particularly postmenopausal women. So there was that whole relationship to risk of Alzheimer's is higher in women who've had early menopause or a hysterectomy.
Okay.
Early hysterectomy, not because of the impact of estrogen on memory. And so that was one of those really big eye-openers and probably a little hard to deal with.
Okay.
The balancing blood sugar that I've already mentioned, I think, was just so critical across everything else. And then really honing in on what is the driver for the cognitive decline. You know, whether it's mold, whether it's chemical toxicity, whether it's, you know, blood sugar related, what is it that's driving it? Because unless you get to the bottom of that, you're not really going to get you're not really going to get sustained improvement.
Okay.
There's like 140 different tests that they include in their protocol, so it is a little overwhelming. And I don't use all of it because most of my clients don't have $10,000 to spend on medical tests.
Yeah, it is a lot, but I think that the information that we can glean from things like this is profound. And what seems to be the theme running through today is a lot around the blood sugar levels and keeping them as steady as possible and maintaining them as evenly as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Any last minute things you'd like to share with us, Christine?
I think if you can, I would actually really encourage you to read Dale Bredesen's book on the end of Alzheimer's.
Okay, great.
Because I think as a practitioner, it's a really great insight into the sort of work you can do for this demographic. And it is such a challenge. Like if you're not personally experiencing a challenge, I'm sure there is someone who you know that is experiencing that challenge. And it is written at a good level that someone who's not a practitioner can actually read it. So I think that's a really useful book to read. And then I'd say the other thing is sign up for Terry Wall's weekly research updates because they're also really great information too.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And I think you have an online course. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
I do. I have a program called Aging Outrageously.
Great name. Love that name.
Thank you. Well, I figured the generation that wore miniskirts and protested wasn't going to be a generation that was going to, you know, go nicely into a retirement village.
Good point.
And I wanted to make sure they had the longest health span possible. So what I've done is I've created an 8-module program that's stripped out over 8 weeks. And I cover off on all the key basics that I've discussed, a lot of what I've discussed today in terms of the balancing blood sugar and the brain health and sleep.
Right.
And exercise, and it's available on my website.
Wonderful. We will make sure that link is in the show notes for everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christine.
You're more than welcome, Elma.
Thank you everyone for listening today. Don't forget that you can find all the show notes, transcripts and other resources from today's episode on the FX Medicine website. I'm Emma Sutherland. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. This podcast is intended as healthcare practitioner education only, and it is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to FX Medicine, and share us with your family, friends, and colleagues.